Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, Reclaiming History, Non-Jewish Victims of the Holocaust, featuring Dr. William Meineke of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm so glad you could join us today. I'm Paul Regelbrug, Teaching and Learning Specialist for the Holocaust Center for Humanity. And just for the first, 10, 15 minutes or so, I want to just sort of highlight some really incredible resources and events that are forthcoming that are sponsored by directly or created by the Holocaust Center. So bear with me just a few moments and we'll segue into Dr. Meineke's presentation. So I'm just going to share a screen here. And here we go. So first up here on April the 8th, Thursday, April 8th, it's Yom HaShoah, and join us please for Holocaust Remembrance Day. It occurs from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time. And this will be an incredible program that includes the story of Ingrid Stepich and Maud Dam. It's a Holocaust story of a rescuer and the rescued, and will feature as well a candle lighting. All of this part of this facet of the ceremony will be in honor and remembrance of the 6 million Jewish people and the millions of non-Jewish people murdered during the Holocaust. So please join us for that, for this important event. Another thing I'd like to share here is our book by book program. So I realize that for so many of the educators who have been teaching remotely and things, that maybe actual hard copies of texts and things aren't really being used. But whether you are doing so this year or even perhaps considering for next year, this is an incredible program that has been created by our Director of Education, Alana Cohn-Kennedy, in cahoots with our development department, and also with the generous contributions of donors. That basically it operates a little bit like Donors Choose, if you know of that program, where any teacher teaching in any public school that in Washington State that is looking to round out or to add various Holocaust-related literature to, whether it's literature circles or whether a class set of a book, you can apply for a grant of up to $500. And it's so easy, and the turnaround is pretty quick on this. So all you have to do is just sort of click the application process, and from that you can choose any of the texts mentioned and featured in the literature section of our best practices page. So all of the information is here, and the application is at the bottom of this page on our website. So again, I mean, what teacher doesn't want free books? So great opportunity. So that segues into our best practices. So any Washington teacher here hopefully already knows that anyone that in April of 2019, the Holocaust education law went into effect, which technically, though it strongly encourages teaching about the Holocaust in Washington, if you are teaching about the Holocaust, however, everyone must adhere to what is specifically laid out in our best practices. And these best practices have been designed and created for teachers regardless of grade level, regardless of ELA or English language arts or social studies, but they're designed in a user-friendly way, whether you're brand new to teaching about the Holocaust or whether you've been teaching about it for a number of years. And it's very simply laid out and organized as chronologically as possible by themes. And for each, there are overviews as well as deeper dives. And this is the Holocaust literature section that I was mentioning before that connects into our book by book program. So it's really been presenting variations on these best practices to so many different schools and school districts over the past several months, and the reviews have just been phenomenal. So we're very grateful for that. And honestly, we're just really tickled pink about it, because that's what it's for. This is, in education, it's about sharing to hope to try to make, young kids learning even more impactful, and ideally utilizing this education in ways that create more likely upstander behavior and civic action, let alone civic awareness. So the easiest way to take a look at it is right under where I start. There is a graphic that looks just like this. And it really lays out sort of the concept of what these best practices are, starting with consideration of the guidelines for teaching the Holocaust or genocide, establishing rationale, and all of the things on here are hyperlinked to things that already exist in our best practices website. There's documents you could click here in terms of creating a safe, responsible, respectful classroom environment by classroom contracts and letters home. I've found that when engaging families with the intent and the scope and the purpose of why their students will be learning about the Holocaust, it not only sort of heads off at the front, any potential questions, but in addition, I've found every single time that by the time we get speakers or, field trips and things, I have parents in line basically like, I want to come too, I want to come too. And it makes for a real wonderful dialogue between students and families and things like that, that brings everyone together for this important learning. From there, we go into the context and we have recommendations of how to best create historical context, again, honoring one of the key fundamental guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust. Then we have resources as previously shown regarding recommended Holocaust literature and the history social studies path, the deeper dive lessons that are contained within the themes on our best practices page. We strongly recommend, as I'll show you in a moment here, including speaker testimony and our live virtual field trips. And then a little plug as well that I'll show is a great way to culminate your students' learning of the lessons of the Holocaust is for them to enter into our writing, art, and film contest. So moving down, let's see here, that looks like this, the writing, art, film contest. The deadline for the contest is April 30th, so it's kind of already just around the corner. But I and so many teachers in Washington and beyond, as you see, it's open to teachers from other states as well. It's such a powerful learning opportunity and teaching opportunity, really, because we have diverse writing prompts that all embed and include the links that they would go to, so there's no danger about wandering into sort of strange alien territory and finding like inappropriate type of links. But everything is self-contained. There are rubrics, there's prizes for winners in each of the categories. And so as a teacher, I've found as a great opportunity to, for example, teach argumentative writing. And then, as a culmination of what they've been learning throughout their lessons, they have an opportunity to now connect what they've learned and reflect based on like the foundations that you set with something like the Pyramid of Hate activity. And it gives kids such an incredible connection, whether through writing or through art or film, to be able to show this is what I learned and this is my vow. This is what I hope to effectuate and do in my own life, because I realize that I, at my age or young person's age, have a voice, have a power, and need to speak out for fear of worse and worse, more egregious circumstances happening if we allow hatred to go unchecked. So really great contest. I invite you to participate, and if you have any questions, please just contact me directly at paul@holocaustcenterseattle.org. Two other great programs I just want to quickly highlight here are our Speakers Bureau, which has gone virtual. So all of our speakers now have been presenting. We've had so many requests. It's been amazing to see so many requests from places far beyond Washington as well, where speakers now are able to kind of come into your classroom for, typically approximately 30 to 45 minutes or so. And it's amazing when you do your request. Let's say you are learning, your kids are learning about Anne Frank and hiding and rescue and things. So a real wonderful way to broaden and diversify the concept and your students' understanding of such themes would be to, when you connect with Julia Thompson, my colleague, she will help provide you with a survivor who will speak to those very issues perhaps, and then really give a wonderful breadth to your students' learning. It's such a powerful program, both from the survivors that still are able to speak and now our increasingly amazing legacy speaker group. You can see, by scanning through here, there's the request form, and you can take a look at many of the speakers through this link here, and such powerful, powerful testimony and experiences. And indeed, Echoes and Reflections, one of the preeminent organizations for Holocaust education, certainly in this country and beyond, they did a survey of United States college students just last year and found a direct correlation between students, high school and middle school students who learned about the Holocaust that included survivor speaker testimony, that such students are significantly more likely to not only engage in more likely upstander behavior, but also their critical thinking skills are significantly higher. And as teachers, you all know that that really matters in normal years where test scores and things like that are counted. One other program that I want to quickly show you here is our live virtual field trip. So just like the speakers, the field trips is really taken off now in many ways, because previously, of course, you would have to be in and around the Seattle area exclusively for a field trip to really be tenable for you and your students. But now we've been getting requests again, also even from out of state, where we provide a docent from our museum. And that docent, once we know, for example, are you hoping to use a field trip kind of introductory as a hook, or are your students studying this particular theme or something? And in that way, we can cater the presentation towards specifically what your students might be learning. And therefore, through primary sources and artifacts and things, your students can really see firsthand and hear interesting additional stories that will hopefully help resonate with them and make their stories come to life and be more memorable. And the last thing I want to show you that'll hopefully be a nice little segue into here before I introduce Dr. Meineke is that I wanted to show you this recent lesson that we just developed. This is a series of lessons called Growing Up Black in Nazi Germany. It is a 4-lesson curricula, and it is essentially based on the experiences of one of the 20,000 or so Afro-Germans growing up during he was growing up in Nazi Germany. He was just a young boy. He's pictured there, you can see. In fact, some of the resource material that we utilized in creating these amazing lessons, you have choices that even include found poetry, and there's tons of different documents that teachers can use. You don't need to do all 4. You can choose any one of them that fit within the purpose. But I've found too that it does a real great job of really introducing at the front part of your lessons to students the full breadth, that this wasn't just exclusively the persecution of Jewish people, but let's kind of unpack the persecution of one of the targeted groups, which was Afro-Germans. And so everything is here, and what I was mentioning is that some of the resources that were utilized and are cited throughout these lessons is indeed information written by and created by our guest today, Dr. Meineke. And so Dr. Meineke joined the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1992, and he was part of the original design team of the museum's Wexner Center's multimedia program on the Holocaust, the Historical Atlas of the Holocaust, and the Student Learning website. In June of 2000, Dr. Meineke joined the museum's education division, and he wrote the book Nazi Ideology and the Holocaust. It was written in 2007, and hopefully you all received at least an excerpt of the introduction to that book. For the last 10 years, Dr. Meineke has shared his expertise in numerous venues internationally, and he has specialized in Holocaust seminars, working with law enforcement officers, judges, prosecutors, and attorneys regarding Holocaust history and the law. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Will Meineke, and I would like to encourage that throughout, hopefully you're actively listening, because he will be pausing at certain strategic points that will make sense, where your questions and or responses to questions are not only invited, but are encouraged. Dr. Meineke, thank you. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's my privilege to be here this afternoon for you, evening for me. I'm speaking from my basement office in my house in Baltimore. Even though I've been at the museum for almost 30 years, I still live in Baltimore, of all places. And I just think it's amazing that I can talk to you all the way across the country in Seattle. Now, I'm going to be spending the next hour and 45 minutes or so exploring Nazi ideology and its relationship to Nazi policy towards primarily non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Now, I will give some context here about using Nazi ideology to explain Nazi state policy, not just towards non-Jewish victims, but also Germans, the Nazi constituency, to the Jews as a part of a context, and then show how each victim group is treated slightly differently and depending on how it's related to Nazi ideological thinking. So I'm making a couple of points here that I think it's important to point out from the start. First, you should know that I'm a German scholar, so I'm a scholar of German history. My background academically is I am a student of the German court system in Weimar and Nazi Germany, so Nazi law. For the museum, my area of expertise is Nazi state policy, formation, and implementation. So I definitely come at this history through the lens of the Holocaust as a problem of German history. We have to sort of explain why Germans are the perpetrators here and how that functioned. The next thing I think you need to think about while we're going through this whole process is that I'm making a particular argument about the motor of the Holocaust and the victimization of other groups. And that motor is not economics, it's not nihilism, it's the way the Nazis thought about how the world really functioned and operated. And as part of that context, I'm going to be talking about Nazi ideology, meaning the system of ideas and the thinking of the circle around Hitler and Nazi government policymakers. Ideology is a definite view of how the world functions, how the world works, and it's an action plan to take action in order to achieve a wanted ends. It's not at all culture, right? Culture is when these ideas become so commonplace in everyday life that they are almost invisible to ordinary people because it's part of the makeup of their ideas. It's become a new norm. I'm not talking about that process. I'm talking about the thinking of Hitler and his immediate entourage and how that then affected government policy, right? It's for me, it's extraordinarily difficult to talk about when these ideas become part of German culture because it's hard to get at what people are thinking in a totalitarian system, right? So totalitarian dictatorship, it's dangerous often to say what you think. So getting evidence of what people think and how people are thinking about even a particular policy can be extraordinarily difficult. So I want to leave that off the table. I'm talking primarily about the thinking of Hitler and the people around Hitler and the policymakers of the German government towards not just Germans, but Jews and then other victims of the Holocaust era. Notice too that the title here, when we talk about the victims of the Holocaust era, that's because primarily the Holocaust is the Jewish experience. So when we're talking about the experience of the other groups that were actually first mentioned by the President's Committee for the study of the Holocaust that really recommended establishing the museum as a living memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. Well, they talked about also non-Jewish victims, and they did it in a very particular way. We're looking at groups where the Nazis sort of victimized them related in some way to Nazi racial thinking, right? That's the key here that we're trying to get at. I think the thing that's important to remember is that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, today I'm going to be evil. So even Hitler didn't wake up and say he's going to be evil. The things that he does, he thinks are necessary in order to reach some good goal. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to achieve a particular good goal. So I want to start by looking at the basic tenets of Nazi ideology. I've simplified them. You should have a sort of a cheat sheet, a PowerPoint slide that lists the basic assumptions of Nazi racial ideology. And these assumptions, it's important to remember that you either believe them or you don't. You can't argue with them. You can't try to reason them. These are fundamental points of belief, right? So let's look at the first fundamental point of belief of Nazi racial ideology. And that first basic assumption is that there is a collective instinct for survival, and that every member of society, of German society, partakes of this collective instinct. I've noticed here that I put a little supplementary uh, uh, race hygiene book for middle school students. And look at how they're talking about how people live in societies. They're saying that, you know, the individual person is meaningless. What's important is the role of that person in maintaining the health and superiority and survivability of the group as a whole. That everyone has their particular job, and they are meaningless as an individual, but they are important as part of the whole. Now, most people would understand this instinct for survival because there's an individual instinct for survival. It's what keeps us from walking in front of a bus, right? The Nazis insist that then members of German society then have a collective instinct that conditions individuals that are part of that collective to behave in ways that promotes the survival of the group as a whole, not just the survival, but the dominance of the group as a whole over time. And this conditioning is subconscious. It's not something that people think about. They just naturally behave in ways that promote the survival of the group as a whole. Now, in Nazi racial ideology, this is what the part of National Socialism that is the socialism part. When you hear National Socialism, socialism is really, in Nazi thinking, the national community, the Volksgemeinschaft. Now, I hate the translation of Volksgemeinschaft into national community because Volksgemeinschaft literally means folk is people and Gemeinschaft is community. But folk in German has a mystical connotation, meaning people that are connected by a common culture or a common language, a common experience, a common relationship to the soil that is Germany that makes them share a common destiny. It's that kind of community. It's the people as a whole, and that sort of Volksgemeinschaft then has an instinct for survival that transcends every individual. It transcends all divisions. All those other divisions in German society at the time are meaningless, whether it be, you know, class differences or regional differences between the North and the South, or religious differences between Lutherans and Catholics and Jehovah's Witnesses or Jews. None of those religious differences or regional differences or class differences matter. What really matters is this membership in this mystical gestalt creature called the national community, the Volksgemeinschaft. That this is a race consciousness of Aryan Germans who accept then the leadership of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, of course, to lead this collective into a glorious future, right? Now, there are two things that threaten the national community, and this is what then is conditioned individuals behave in ways that try to counteract these threats. The threats come from within and from without. So the second fundamental basic assumption of Nazi racial ideology is that the survival of the race depends on race purity. Now, if you think of Germans, you know, Hitler tended to use people, nation, people, nation, race interchangeably. If you think of Germans as a collective group, anytime they intermarry outside their group, they are diluting what it means to be a German. They are diluting those behavior patterns, those ideas, those physical characteristics that promote the survival of the group as a whole. And over time, that could mean then the complete destruction of the race as a whole and the creation of a new Mongol race that is the inferior of everything around you. You know, take a look at this image. This image, that's a race hygienist that's actually physically measuring the features of that woman's face. Because race hygienists at the time, this was thought of as cutting edge science, they thought that if they could just measure carefully enough, they'd be able to find that physical characteristic they could use to identify who's a German, who's a Jew, who's a Slav, and also show them the superiority of Germans, right? That's the goal here. So race purity has to be maintained at all costs. And this is typical, not just of the Nazis, but really of almost every racist I've ever studied, right? Racist group that I've ever studied. They always talk about race purity because you're diluting what it means to be a German, right? But they're also under threat from without. because there is this normal competition for scarce resources, especially land, in order to expand the number of people that are part of your group. This idea that Germany has more people than the land that can support it is not a Nazi idea. This is sort of a common idea in the pre-World War I and interwar German years. You can see this book by Hans Grimm, People Without Space, 1926, saying that Germany, if it's hemmed in, if it can't expand outside of its current borders, is doomed to destruction over the long term, because the soil simply cannot support the number of Germans that exist. Right now, the chief competitor here are going to be the peoples of the East, right, the Slavs, because that's the part of the natural course of history that different ethnic groups coalesced in separate ethnic states will wage wars over control of territory and resources in order to expand their population base. So if you're looking at interwar Germany, Germany has a population of about 60 million. If you add Austria and the Sudetenland, it's about 80 million. And in the East, there are about 180 million Slavs. So it looks like the Slavs outnumber the Germans by double. So that threat is really dire and it's pressing, right? The sort of the last basic assumption of Nazi racial ideology is that not all races are equal. Not all peoples or nations or races are equal. Some are more capable than others. Then, of course, in Nazi thinking, the people at the pinnacle of all of this are Aryan Germans, sort of North Germans, blonde, fair-haired, tall, sporty people. That's the ideal Aryan German. Now, it's ridiculous to say that the Germans reflect that image. Only about a third of Germans really reflect that image, because there's Nazis. Well, there's a South German Aryan and an East German Aryan and a West German Aryan, as well as the sort of the ideal Nordic type Aryan. But in any case, all Germans are Aryan, but not all Aryans are German, right? That's a bigger group. But what's important is to maintain the national community, to maintain the defenses of that race against the enemy within and the enemy without, and to remember to reinforce the hierarchy of the races, that Germans should be thought of as superior and dominant in the long term. So if you put all these together, you get a very powerful platform for action. Virtually everything the Nazi German state did in the 30s and 40s, I can relate back to these basic assumptions of Nazi racial ideology that we can tie to Hitler. And this is clear not just in his thinking in Mein Kampf, it's clear in all his public statements, all his major speeches from 1920 on. This is the basic idea of how he thinks the world really functions. In this, Hitler thinks of himself as a great thinker on the scale of Hegel and Marx. Hegel thought all of human history could be explained through the conflict of ideas, that an idea would naturally generate its antithesis and the two would conflict, that would then create a synthesis, which would then again create its antithesis, and they would conflict, and it would go on and on and on. And that's how you explain change over time. Marx said, no, it's economic. It's the relationship between the individual and the means of production. As that changed over time, then everything in society changed over time. Well, for Hitler, he says it's not ideas, it's not economics, it's really your racial makeup. Your racial makeup, that being part of that collective is so important. And the struggle with neighboring collectives, neighboring races, really sets the tone of all of human history, all of human development as a result of these racial conflicts. So it's racial struggle for scarce resources and to expand the population base and to expand then the national community, the Volksgemeinschaft. Okay, so let's take a look at how this then applies to some of the well-known policies of Nazi Germany towards Germans. This is the ideal image that's created from this sort of basic assumptions of Nazi racial ideology. It's the blood and soil vision of Germany's future. Notice that these are all tall Nordic types, blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair-skinned. The younger children, the boy and this girl here is wearing uniforms of the Hitler Youth, one for boys and one for girls, the League of German Girls, and then of course the Hitler Youth. The father is wearing a peasant shirt because the ideal in the Nazi vision is German farmers farming land they've conquered in the East, raising food in order to support an ever expanding population base. Does that reflect reality? Absolutely not. We know that Germany is largely urban and it's largely industrial. It's not in any case agrarian or rural. And this is just part of the myth that the Nazis create of the future they're trying to create for Germany as a whole. You look at them, they're looking confidently into the future. They all seem healthy and happy. This is the German national community. This is the Nazi constituency. Now, as a side note, I have to say that when I was at the National Institute of Health in Atlanta doing a program on Nazi medicine, I saw a very similar poster that said healthy parents have healthy children. So, mothers and fathers, be careful of your health because your health will determine the health of your children over time. Right? This is called Stew Sunday. It was a campaign in the pre-war Nazi Germany where they said, well, look, we should all then promote this solidarity of the German folk community by every Sunday, instead of having this huge meal that's traditional on Sunday noon, that it would be a multi-course meal. Instead of doing that, why don't we just have a stew, relatively low-cost stew that you just sort of spoon out into bowls. And the difference in cost between the multi-course meal and the stew, you would then donate to the Nazi charity organization, the NSV, the National Socialist Volkswohlfahrt, so National Socialist People's Welfare Agency. And then this is, you have it at home by yourself and then just donate it to the NSV, or there would be these big public events where everyone was having a community meal together. Usually these were like pea soup or ham soup and the like. So this was, again, to promote this idea that our membership in the community is more important than class differences or religious differences or even regional differences. Second policy, everybody knows the Nazis were absolutely fans of physical fitness, that public sport, like you see here of the League of German Girls undergoing physical conditioning. This was everywhere in German society. So much so that sports became a mandatory examination topic of the school leaving exam, the Abitur. And the gym instructor became often the vice principal of the schools. The idea was that if Germany was a dominant race and it was destined to conquer most of Europe and rule as a Herrenvolk, a lord people, then they should be physically fit. So physical fitness became one of the hallmarks of Nazi public policy in school policy, and also physical fitness in all the Nazi organizations had some aspect of an emphasis on physical fitness. So much so, here is a school class that's was throwing mock hand grenades as a school sport. So schools aren't just trying to make the kids physically fit, they also are educating them, in warfare. That basically, after they finish school, this is Hitler's thinking, they would be able then just to go right to the military, and all they'd have to learn is military discipline. They'd be healthy, they'd be fit, and they'd have rudimentary skills that are required for every soldier, right? So this is part of Nazi public policy towards their own constituency, towards those they regard as fully Aryan Germans, as defined by the Nuremberg laws, right? This is the schematic that shows then how the Nazis think of these other groups, not so much Hitler, but as the level below Hitler, the level of the police, especially Himmler and Heydrich, Hess, certainly Goebbels and Goering, that these other groups, they think in terms of, well, how do they relate then to Nazi ideology, and what's the chief danger posed by these other groups? Jews, they know as the overall racial enemy. Hitler's always talking about the Jewish danger. He's obsessed with the Jewish enemy, the so-called Jewish enemy. So these other groups I think are interesting because I've grouped them, again, this is a bit of a simplification, but it's a useful simplification, around the primary basic assumption in Nazi ideology, which the Nazis thought the group most threatened. So one of this idea, remember the Volksgemeinschaft, this sort of collective instinct for survival of the German people. The danger from within came from people who would race mix with lesser peoples. So looking at then the Romani as a lesser people that exist in Germany, there are about 50,000 Romani in Germany proper, and that if they intermarried with a non-Romani Germans, they would then, undermine the racial value of the German people as a whole. Similarly, German disabled persons, the Nazis wanted a healthier, more productive society, and people with inherited disabilities or people in long-term care facilities undermined the public welfare, the public health of the German people as a whole. So they were a threat then to not just racial purity, but the dominance of the Aryan German race. And then Germans of African descent, they were a small group, but still the Nazis considered them a threat because they regarded them as the people's, a non-European people. They were considered most closely to a state of nature, which meant then that they would seek to reproduce constantly, and that over time would be a major threat to the German folk politique. The racial struggle for Europe, that's the Slavs. Again, it's this 80 million Germans versus 170 million Slavs. This is part of how Hitler thought that history worked, that neighboring races competed over the same territory for scarce resources and for arable land, and that right now the Slavs are winning. But he saw that the outcome is not yet set, and that there would be a chance then for Germany to break out of its confinement, its encirclement, and win a vast empire in Europe, in the East, where then Germans can turn the tables because of their racial superiority and dominate the Slavs. So that's part of the natural course of how human history progresses over time. Not the ideology and the persecution of Germans. These groups, political dissidents, German Jehovah's Witnesses, German male homosexuals, these were groups that otherwise would be members of the German body politic of the nation. They'd be part of the Volksgemeinschaft. But for one reason or another, they have alienated themselves from the national community, either through the rejection of Nazi leadership or through the refusal to integrate into the national community, or because they're not doing their full duties as German men, in this case, male homosexuals, right? So all of these relate then to this Nazi ideology of the basic assumptions of Nazi ideology, and then it becomes really much easier to understand the varying nature of the policies towards each group, right? So I think this is a good time to see, Paul, if there are any questions about Nazi ideology that have come up so far that you think will further the conversation.
One question that came up, Dr. Meineke, was this policy, were the policies towards these various persecuted groups articulated? I mean, is it contained in Mein Kampf? I mean, or is this ultimately, is it a combination of articulation and implication?
Well, the only other group that Hitler mentions in Mein Kampf are Africans. And then he insists that the French stationed African troops in the Rhineland as a way the Jews were really behind that as a way to spread race mixing, because he assumes that Jews want race mixing. All the other groups he doesn't really mention very much. It's really the level of the police. So Himmler, Heydrich, that talks about that. And their policies, there are police orders. There are some laws that come into effect that affect these groups. The Nuremberg laws, for example, apply also to Romani living in Germany, to Germans of African descent, to Slavs living in Germany. So the Nuremberg laws are applied not just to Jews, even though the law specifically mentions Jews as an inferior race. It also applies to these other groups. And similarly, there are other laws that target a particular group over another that we'll be talking about later on. So mostly it's about state policy and law, if that makes sense.
Yes,
And
it
it's
does.
not public statements from Hitler. He's obsessed with Jews. He talks about Jews constantly,
Yeah.
right? I think in that case, Raoul Hilberg is really right when he says, when one group is targeted, it never stays with the one group.
Hmm.
That as similar groups are thought about and targeted, is because they somehow relate to the original group that's being targeted. And I think you'll see some of that case here.
Thank you. Another question came in from Tanya, and she asks, why were male homosexuals targeted in a way that female homosexuals were not?
That's a good question. And normally I'd say, wait until we talk about it, but I think it's useful to talk about here at the moment. Partly it's because German law from the Imperium on only targeted male homosexual activity. It was never against the law to be gay in Germany. But the law criminalized male homosexual behavior, in part, I think, because they regarded male homosexual behavior as a bigger threat to society. Whether it's because they regarded women as not fully responsible citizens. This is, after all, the 19th and early 20th century, or whether they regarded women as not capable of running their own affairs, of having been responsible to their husband or their fathers or their brothers. Sybil Milton used to laugh at that. She was a historian at the museum, because she'd say, well, the Nazis arrest prostitutes all the time. So you mean the only responsible woman in German society are prostitutes? So, it's an issue. But for the Nazis, they never thought to expand the persecution of homosexual behavior to women, in part because the role of women in their ideology was that women were going to be wives and mothers. And, it is misogynist to say that they don't have to want to be a wife or a mother. They can still fulfill that role without difficulty. So it's only male homosexual activity which they saw as the bigger threat, and partly a demographic threat, which we'll talk about, when we talk about homosexuals.
In the spirit of demographic, Janelle asks a question: what demographic participated, if you know, in the Sunday communal dinners?
Oh, it was the whole community. It was, every social class. It was the wealthy, the poor. It was really meant to be seen as everyone who could spare the time would show up at these events. They were actually really cost effective. They were relatively cheap. For a mark or a couple of pfennigs, you could get a meal, and then you were expected to make a donation to the Nazi charity. Right. The idea is that no German should freeze in winter. No German should hunger for lack of food.
Interesting. One more question just came in. Helen asks, will you be talking about the creation of and how brown shirts, the essay, assisted in enforcing the Nazi ideology?
I won't be talking about them per se, because that focuses a little over the line on the Nazis. I want to look at Nazi policy formation and how that's then implemented, targeting specific groups. But there will be a couple places where we'll talk about the essay, yes.
Thank you so much. Please proceed.
Great. So I just want to encourage you to write the questions that come to your mind as we were going through this presentation in the notes field, and then there'll be a couple of natural places to stop where we can then, Paul will report out questions that will help advance the conversation. I think that would be great as one way to really promote participation in what is, after all, one directional seminar. So let's look at then Nazi policy towards Jews, just to give context to the other groups. Now, the first fundamental point of belief that the Nazis have is that Jews are a race. They reject Jews as a religious or cultural group. They insist that Jews are a race, and since they are a race, they have the same collective instinct for survival and dominance as every other group, as every other ethnic group, as every other race. Because they don't have a territorial base, they don't have a natural connection to the soil, they live as a parasite to host populations that are the sort of the natural group that is connected to the land. If you think about a parasite can be within a body, it can be attached to a body, but it's never part of the body, right? And in Hitler's thinking, if the Jews have no territory, they should have then undergone a long process of destruction down to where there would be no Jews left in current society because they have no territorial base to support themselves. And since they still exist in German society and in every society in Europe, he postulated, not that he was wrong about the need for territory, but that Jews have somehow acted counter to the rules of history and have found a special way to ensure their survival by enslaving the host population to work for their own dominance, for the dominance of Jews, right? So they always seek to weaken the host population and to use that host population in order to further Jewish goals. So in this context, Jews are the special enemies of the German people. If Germans are culture creators, if everything that's connected to the development of the achievement of Western civilization is due to Aryan German supremacy, then everything that is destructive in society is because of the existence of Jews. Hitler postulated, again, remember, they are conditioned to act in ways that support their own, that furthers their own dominance. That doesn't have to be conscious thought. So the mere presence of Jews in society bring about decay of that society and eventually revolution. Right? Take a look at the image of the Jew in that propaganda poster for the eternal Jew. I mean, Jews in German society, they don't look like that. Hitler insists that that is the real face of Judaism in Germany. And look at the connection then to Soviet communism, which he argues is the tool that Jews use to enslave the local population to serve Jewish ends, right? In one hand, he's got gold coins symbolizing international finance capitalism. And under his arm, he's got an outline of the Soviet Union with the hammer and sickle of the Soviet flag. So Jews are behind international finance capitalism and international Soviet Bolshevism. Now, anyone who's lived through the Cold War, like I have, would know that those two groupings have diametrically opposing goals. But for the Nazis, the goal was really very simple. Jewish financiers disrupt the economy, throw millions of people out of work to create the conditions that allow for a communist revolution. That's the key connection that Hitler sees between the two. And it seems to fit then his ideological goal, of expansion eastward, because the Slavs live to the east, and the Soviet Union is the one country where Jews have dominated and created a communist state. Most Jews in Europe live to the east. So it all seems to make perfect sense to Hitler that Germany's expansion to the east will solve the problem of getting resources for the expansion of the Aryan German race and destroy their chief enemy, communism and the Jews, right? So it all works together. And we can see, the reality in Germany is this public school classroom in Hamburg in June 1933. So after the Nazis have come to power, but before the Nazis have had a chance to make any real changes in the school or in the curriculum. Now, I happen to know that the little girl here in the middle is named Eva Rosenbaum, and she's Jewish. I have my pointer pointed to her. Look at her. She's fully part and parcel of that classroom. She's integrated into that class. She looks like everybody else. She speaks German like everybody else. This was a photograph that she took with her when she left Germany on the Kindertransport to find refuge in Britain. And we were very grateful she donated this to the museum. Now, and Hamburg, remember, was the center of the left socialist communist politics in the Republic. So it's not a Nazi stronghold at all. And here we see, that Jews are really, in fact, invisible and equal members of German society. The Nazis insist they want to change that. And part of how they changed that very early on is this boycott. Now, most historians point to this and say the boycott was a complete failure. It was reduced from an eternal boycott to a one-day boycott because, the German economy was so fragile that they were afraid that it would really, knock them into an economic crisis that they could never recover from. But I argue that there's some success here because the Nazis are changing the discourse of public conversation, right? And here we see, the main proponents of this boycott are the SA, and this is the connection to the SA here. Um, but look at the subtext of the sign. That's the key here. This is how they're changing the discourse of public society. Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews. That's Deutsche, wehrt euch, kauft nicht bei Juden, right? So the subtext here is that the Germans and Jews are two separate peoples, right? Definitely reflects Nazi ideology. And the relationship between those two peoples are hostile, with Jews being the aggressor, because you don't defend yourself against enemies. I mean, you don't defend yourselves against friends, right? And the way you defend yourself is to not contribute to the economic well-being of what is, after all, a hostile enemy population in your midst, right? So that is changing then the whole dialogue of public discourse. Excuse me.
Will,
So,
could I briefly interrupt with two quick questions here that came in?
yes, of
Okay,
course.
one of them was in the 2 slides ago, and Chrissy asks, it was the one with the Eternal Jew poster, and she asks, why are Jews, as in this poster, associated with communism when previously in history they've been associated with usury? This seems contrary.
Well, I think both contexts are clearly visible in this poster. Now, you have to remember that the revolutionary period and the interwar period, that's when there's the Soviet takeover in the Soviet Union. So the Soviets are the minority communist party that then sets up the dictatorship in the Soviet Union and survives. But in the post-war period, there are also numerous attempted communist revolutions in Germany. Outside of the Soviet Union, Germany has the largest working class movement. So, the Germans were really very concerned about revolutionary agitation. You're talking about from the Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919, 1920, and then attempts to overthrow even the state of Saxony in the late 20s. And many of the leaders of these revolutionary movements were Jews. So Hitler's able to point to that and say, well, see, Jews are communists, and they're using communism as a way to enslave Germans to their will. Now, I know that if you do an analysis of electoral patterns, that most Jews voted for the German Democratic Party, the DDP, which supported the Weimar Republic, which was in essence the German Liberal Party, not the radical communist party at all. But you can't speak reason to people who have fundamental points of belief that insist that Jews support communism, period, right? So the two stereotypes are playing off each other here. Notice too that the Jew, the caricature of the Jew depicted here in this poster is holding a flail. The flail refers to the crucifixion of Christ. So even though Nazis are racial anti-Semites, they're not beyond using religious symbology as a way to further their goal of fomenting anti-Semitism among ordinary Germans, right? Even religious anti-Semitism.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Thank you. The other question, if I can paraphrase, is the question relates to the fact that Jewish people comprised fewer than 1% of the entire German population. And so therefore, is the answer to justify, this sort of build up on this slide here, that it was the mere presence of the Jewish people that could be parasites even in such small numbers that could somehow contort the national goals?
That's a good point. I think it's important that Hitler is an Austrian, and it's definitely in the Austrian Empire from around the turn of the century that there's a feeling of Germandom under assault by foreign ethnic groups, especially Slavic groups. So I think Hitler carries that mentality into the German context, but he's able to convince Germans that Jews dominate, even though, for example, they're 0.8% of the population, they're 16% of all lawyers. And the Nazis will say, see, they're dominating law. They're creating Jewish law in Germany. We shouldn't have Jewish lawyers do work in German courts. 16% is not dominating. Yes, it is way more than their percentage of the population, but it has to do with historical and cultural factors, not with any kind of malicious plan for dominance. And if you look at 16%, well, that means then that 84% are non-Jewish Germans, and yet they're going to be dominated by 16%. It makes no sense to me. But it's very powerful to anti-Semites, right? who want to believe that Jews are this tremendous danger, even though they're a small percentage of the population. Even in Berlin, it had 160,000 Jews. Berlin had a population of 4 million, so you're talking about 4%. 4% of the population of Berlin were Jewish, and yet, they argue that Jews in Berlin are dominant.
Thank
Right? You can't look at these things rationally. You have to look at these from a position of the fundamental points of belief. And they believe that Jews are a race, that they're attempting to seek dominance by undermining the healthy institutions of the society around them. And that they do this because they're driven biologically to do it. It doesn't have to be a conscious thought on their part. Right? Hitler, in his table talk, he said that there was one good Jew, and that was the Jew that realized their role in history and committed suicide.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bizarre, huh? But it's very powerful in its impact on how you can shape the world if you hold those fundamental points of belief. We can see it also leads them down into a cul-de-sac. So let's look at the first group, the so-called racial enemies of Germans, from the internalized racial enemies of Germans, the Romani, German disabled persons, and Germans of African descent. So again, I think the main point, the main reason why the Nazi German state has oppressive policy towards these three groups is because they are regarded primarily as a threat to German racial purity, right? So here we have a Romani group that has been ordered to set up a camp in Marzahn in Berlin, and then there's a posted police guard around them. In part, this is because local pressure on the police said, well, we live in a dictatorship now. This is very early in the Nazi period. They said, well, we should be protected from these, criminal types. They take the Romani, the stereotypes of Romani as criminal to the extreme and say, well, we need protection from them. So, without any kind of national policy, they simply order these caravans of Romani people to park in one place and then post a police guard, right? These very quickly evolve into camps for the Romani over time. And then the Romani are subject of intense study by the police agency in Berlin. Right here we have, for example, a specialist in criminal biology from the Reich Criminal Police Office in Berlin, who's interviewing a Romani woman with police support. Now think about that, a specialist in criminal biology. That means then the Nazis insist that crime has a biological basis. That if you can identify the biological sources of crime and remove them from society, you can have a crime-free society. And really buying in and making it sound more scientific to the stereotype of the Romani, of gypsies as criminal types, serves that function. So here we have them studying, creating a registry of the names and addresses of all the Romani in Germany and Austria at the time. This is about 1936. And then studying their origins, because this is the conundrum. The Romani, the gypsies, originated in northern India and migrated into Europe in about the 9th or 10th century AD, and then spread quickly to the entire continent of Europe. So theoretically, they came from the same place that the Nazis postulated that Aryan Germans came from, the area of northern India. So why aren't then the Romani Aryans? And you can't really persecute Aryans. So this intense study was to show that there's, the Romani had undergone some degeneration in the course of their migration. And that's in fact what the Office of Criminal Biology concludes, is that during the course of their migration into Europe, they had intermixed with lesser peoples and then had created a racial constitution of a particularly virulent kind of criminal biology. And that in order to have this crime-free society, they needed to, German society needed to be protected from them. so that the Romani would have to be identified and systematically removed from German society. The problem here is that by 1933, when the Nazis come to power in Germany, about half the Romani community had settled down and lived in apartments and houses like every other German, and had intermarried with non-Romani Germans, and had jobs like everybody else, and spoke German like everybody else, and had German citizenship like everybody else. But it's just a minority of the community that lived an itinerant lifestyle. And that became then problematic, is why they had to create these lists of names and addresses. And even in the in these gypsy collection camps, every Romani had to have one of these racial classification cards where they're identified by name, including their gypsy name, their Zigeunernamen, and then the various racial measurements. Again, trying to find that characteristic they could use to identify every member of the Romani group and differentiate them from non-Romani Germans, right? That's the goal. It never happens. They never do it. That's why we call it pseudoscience. But they insist if they can only identify that characteristic precisely enough, they will be able to use either a physical characteristic or behavioral characteristic to identify every member of the Aryan German race and every sort of lesser race that endangers the German race, the dominance of the German race as a whole. This map very conveniently shows every camp and ghetto and killing center that included Romani victims. And as you can see, that Romani were amongst the prisoner population of all the concentration camps. Several of the major ghettos in the occupied Poland, and were amongst the victims of all the killing centers. That the Romani of all people were also deported from Western Europe to Eastern Europe and then systematically killed. They're deported from Germany, Austria, especially into Eastern Europe, thousands, tens of thousands into ghettos, into Jewish ghettos. The idea being, well, Jews are a racial enemy and we're deporting these gypsies who are racial enemies. Why not just put them all in the same bucket? So they made actually the Jewish council responsible for the housing and care of the Romani population. And then when the time came to destroy the ghetto, they're amongst the first populations to be deported to the killing center and systematically gassed. Some 20,000 Romani Austrians and Germans are deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, and they're held in the so-called gypsy camp at Auschwitz. And then in one fell swoop one night, they are simply sent to the gas chamber and killed en masse. What's not on this map that I really should take a moment to mention is that, the mobile killing squads, they're assigned to kill Jews behind the front during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Well, they're also told that anytime you come across an itinerant population, a gypsy-like population, you should just slaughter them. So there are tens of thousands of Romani that were just killed by the mobile killing squads. And they solved the problem of how to define who was a Romani and who wasn't by simply saying if they live in a wagon and travel from place to place, they're leading a gypsy-like lifestyle. Therefore, they're gypsies and they should be killed. Right. So again, it's a population that doesn't like to be counted because counting tends to lead to persecution, not just by the Nazis, but by pretty much every government. Again, it's not just the Nazis that assume that they're criminals or criminal types, but it's estimated between 1 and 1.5 million lived in Europe before the war, and between 250,000 and 500,000 perished in what the Romani call the poragimos, the devouring, right? Of all the groups that we're going to talk about today, the Romani have the most similar experience to the Jews, and it's pretty much established by scholars worldwide that the Romani experience was a genocide. So it's perfectly within reason to talk about the genocide of the Romani during World War II.
Will, a question just came in. Was the deportation of the German Roma population simultaneous with the German Jewish population?
It was pretty much in the same period, beginning in the fall of 41 and continuing until either the population was entirely gone, or I'd say the main deportations were before the end of 42. So that period fall of 41 into the end of 42. That period is the main period that is reported from Germany. Good. So now I want to talk about this German disabled people. And part of this comes from this idea that Hitler should be the doctor of the German people. And it explains why, of all the professional groups, doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals had the highest percentage of support for the Nazi Party than any other professional group, even of police officers, right? In part because they saw this as a once in a lifetime chance to help shape public health policy in Nazi Germany. But if you had Hitler's support, you could force Germans to live healthier. That in a dictatorship, if you can convince Hitler that a particular policy is the right way to go, then he would support it, then the policy would happen, right? So this is why I think this idea of Adolf Hitler as the doctor of the German nation, of the German people, becomes so powerful, especially when you see that there is this public perception that Germany's in danger of what's it called, extinction, because of a declining birth rate, because they're hemmed in, cut off from resources and arable land that they need in order to expand their population over time. And this is not necessarily a Nazi idea. This is an idea that goes way back to before World War I, right? That Germany needs more territory, more resources in order to support its population, its industrial base, and that other people like the British, the French, and the Russians were intentionally trying to hem Germany in as part of a plot to destroy it. We can see that the Nazis especially then ramped up propaganda about how taking care of hereditary ill people costs a lot of money that could be better spent furthering healthy Germans and funding healthy Germans to marry and set up a household. So this is just part of a whole series of posters and campaigns that talk about just how expensive caring for the mentally and physically disabled people are, especially in long-term care facilities. Notice the two stereotypes that the Aryan German man is carrying across his shoulders: the tall, blonde hair, fair-skinned, sporty type, right? He's carrying someone who looks like a criminal. That's the guy to the right. He's a criminal type, and he's a character of somebody who's mentally disabled. And the other person is somebody that the Germans would call arbeitsscheu, work shy. So he is an indigent, homeless person who lives out in the street. That's the caricature of that. They're saying that taking care of these people who are basically useless to society is costing society tremendously money that is scarce, and it would be better spent taking care of Aryan, physically fit, productive, useful Germans, right? That kind of thinking goes on, especially since the Nazis passed very early, in July 1933, so very early in the Nazi regime, a forced sterilization law that basically says that any German who had these conditions from birth, this is how they solve it, who has one of these conditions from birth is defined as someone who is physically and mentally disabled and should be then forcibly sterilized to safeguard the body politic of the nation so that they cannot reproduce and further these hereditary diseases into the next generation. Notice number 3, they also include severe alcoholism. So recognizing that alcoholism tends to run in families, and one way you can solve dealing with alcoholics over time is to prevent them from having children. Now, the law also set up hereditary health courts dominated by doctors, and it was considered a public service for doctors to take part in these hereditary health courts. And virtually all, especially the most prestigious doctors, did take part in these courts. The third member of the court was a judge to make sure that all the legal niceties were taken care of, but the court decision is actually made by the doctors. And the philosophy of these courts was better too many than too few. Better too many than too few means, if in doubt, sterilize, because if you allow someone who is mentally or physically disabled to reproduce, you're hurting society as a whole. So it's better to sterilize somebody who could produce a healthy child rather than risk furthering, this disability into the body politic of the nation. Now we're talking here of a completely different kind of program than what existed in the United States for some 76 years. In Germany, it's a mass program. Some 400,000 Germans are forcibly sterilized, especially targeting women, women especially of the poorer classes of society, those that are considered non-productive members of society, right? They're the main bulk of the people who are targeted by the forced sterilization law. And Hitler's okay with that during peacetime, but during war, he insists that there must be another kind of policy. Now, this is a particularly tragic case. I always think it's important to look at an individual who's affected by a particular policy. This is Gerda D. Her last name is protected by German personal information data laws. But she's, has a disputed diagnosis of schizophrenia. So one of these hereditary health courts ordered her forcibly sterilized. And then she got a marriage proposal and wanted to get a marriage certificate. And because the marriage could not produce a healthy baby, which was now required under the law by the Nazi regime, she was forbidden to marry. So double tragedy here, right? I mean, there's somebody whose life is basically destroyed by the policy. During the war, Hitler insists that Germany can't afford to take care of what he called useless eaters, lebensunwertiges Leben, life unworthy of life. And he institutes a secret killing program where he authorized his personal physician and the leader, the director of the section of public health in the Interior Ministry to identify other doctors who were of like mind to go through the long-term care facilities in Germany, identify those patients who A, were not productive, and B, would not be cured in any reasonable time frame, and decide to grant them a mercy death. This is not euthanasia by any stretch of the imagination. This is the government deciding who is not a productive member of society and then killing them, right? Having doctors kill them. And this is the only authorization we have from Hitler where he's authorizing a secret killing program. This is why I don't think we'll find Hitler's signature on any other kind of killing program, because this one blew up in his face. This one caused all kinds of problems. You can see here it's countersigned by Dr. Gertner. He's the Minister of Justice, in part because judges who were responsible in family court noticed that wards of the court, who were basically the ward of the court, that they would be transferred away from their jurisdiction and then turn up dead. So they deduced that there was a secret killing program going on. That was a violation of German law. Paragraph 212 of the German Criminal Code was prescription against murder. Is somebody saying something?
Yeah, there's a couple of quick questions that came in. One, going back a couple of slides, I think it was Tanya was asking, what was the actual reason for the declining birth rate in Germany as opposed to the stated one?
Well, the economic conditions. Most people look at the economic conditions and the instability of the government after the war. That in fact, that the birth rate did recover under the Nazis, and the Nazis touted that as a huge success. But it was never enough for them. They wanted it to really explode.
And another question she asks is, do we know what percentage approximately of those sterilized were men and what percentage were women?
That's an interesting question, but I don't know that. I would do some research. I think that's a very interesting question. I'd like to see that.
Great. And another one here was, do you know, is there a relationship between the social Darwinism that was rampant even in the United States and that was also occurring then in Nazi Germany? That is an intellectual exchange, perhaps.
Right, that gets into more of the source of these basic assumptions that Hitler and the Nazis had. And certainly social Darwinism is a big part of that. Malthusian economics is another big part of that. These are all ideas that are circulating at turn of the century Vienna, where Hitler at the time was leading a kind of bohemian lifestyle, living in pubs and flop houses and reading political pamphlets. It's also where we think he adopted his anti-Semitism because of the anti-Semitic politics of the mayor of Vienna, Karl Weger? Good question.
Very good. Thank you. We're set right now.
Okay, great. So here's Hitler signing the secret authorization for a killing program. And basically what happened is that uh, the, the section for public health in the Ministry of Interior sent these questionnaires to all the long-term care facilities in Germany and asked them to fill it out for every patient in their care. And basically, even though they're talking about their diagnosis and the likelihood of them recovery, the key things here turned out to be race, because of course every Jew would be automatically included in the program. And then the amount of useful work the patient could do unsupervised. That turned out to be the key thing there. And that really puts the lie to the whole euthanasia idea. This wasn't an attempt to relieve pain and grant a mercy death to a suffering patient. This was deciding who was not contributing to the war effort and then just, killing them in order to save resources and free up hospital beds for use by the German military. It became very clear. In any case, those selected by a panel of 3 doctors who didn't work with together, so they looked at these forms individually, and any patient that they decided should be included in the killing program, in this box they would write a minus sign. And as long as 2 of the 3 doctors agreed that the patient should be included in the killing program, the patient was indeed included. And then they were systematically sent to a centralized killing institution, usually a psychiatric clinic that had been converted into a killing center and gassed. So here they're using really industrially produced carbon monoxide gas canisters in order to kill the patients very efficiently. They would then write up false times and causes of death to send to the patients' families. They would then ask if they want the ashes because of the war situation, they had no choice but to immediately cremate the patient. And if the family wanted an urn, they could pay a fee and then get an urn delivered to them. Right, this became common knowledge very quickly that this was a killing program, in part because the families that visited their loved ones in these long-term care facilities talked to each other. And they began to see patterns of people being transferred and turning up dead. Or worse, they'd asked for an urn of their loved one's ashes and 2 urns would arrive. Or, the cause of death, they would write up as just out of sheer boredom, their appendix burst and the patient had had their appendix removed years ago. So it became, because it's a mass program, some 70,000 German patients are killed in a period of about 1.5 years. It becomes known very quickly. And again, I have to put the lie here because the Nazis insist in their propaganda that this was useless life. These were basically lumps of flesh devoid of any kind of feeling. And this is a group of children who have been selected for gassing, for killing. They're waiting for their transport, these sort of gray buses that carry them to the Euthanasian Killing Center. And I just have to point to the little boy who's got a wagon, because that implies that the child plays. And a child that plays is not just a lump of flesh. That's somebody with a will and with a real joy on life, right? So that puts, I think, a lie to the Nazi propaganda that these are people with their own goals, their own dreams. They may not be the same dreams as yours or mine, but they're still valued, right? The Nazis rejected all of that for a purely sort of economic analysis, cost-benefit analysis, if you will. This was then publicly criticized by members of both the Catholic and the Lutheran Church, but most famously by Clemens August von Galen, Bishop of Munster, who basically said, what German in their right mind would go to a doctor? How will you ever know that the doctor is not putting you on some secret list to be killed because you're no longer productive? He really called this a fundamental evil, right? And this became then an open secret in Germany. The sermon was read in every Catholic church in Germany. The Nazis were absolutely furious, um, mostly because the program had become public knowledge. So Hitler was forced to cancel it in July 1941, but he didn't stop the euthanasia killing program. Instead, he switched it to a decentralized version where you're no longer sending whole groups of patients to a facility where they could be gassed en masse. Instead, they're being killed individually in clinics all over Germany. So these white boxes are the centralized gassing installations that were used from October 1939 to July 1941, when they're really closed down as part of the euthanasia killing program. And then instead you have these black dots that indicate clinics where decentralized euthanasia is carried out. And in the decentralized euthanasia, almost double the number of patients are killed than were killed in the centralized gassing installation. So this become part and parcel of German medicine, that you maintain and you protect the German race by cutting off diseased limbs. This is how doctors viewed it, basically. So that initial phase of the program was about 70,000 people killed in that first phase. And the total, at least estimated at the Nuremberg trials, was 275 million people, 275,000, excuse me, people. Today, scholars estimated to be about 220,000. Again, it has to be estimated because the manner of killing in these decentralized clinics were forced starvation on one hand and overdose of medicines on the other. So the main killers became not doctors, but nurses, because they required, they care for patients. They handle patient care and the distribution of medicines, right? The third group that's considered a racial threat by the Nazis are African Germans. Now, it's quite right to say that about 20,000 people of African descent were in Germany when the Nazis came to power in 1933. Overwhelmingly, however, most of them were not German citizens. I think most of them were French citizens. So when the environment became hostile, they simply left. And they went then to back home, back to France. Only about 2,500 Germans of African descent had German citizenship, right? So they had no place to go. They have to be in Germany. And one of those groupings are basically Germans of African descent that come from the German colonies. After World War I, Germany lost all its colonies. That meant then that those colonials who had been granted German citizenship because of some special service had to leave the colonies and come back to Germany. One of them you see here is the offspring of one of these citizens from Cameroon that came back. His name is Harry Davis. His father was one of these natives that were granted German citizenship because of some special boon they had done to the German administration. And then, of course, he had a German mother. So that's one of the groups that constitute these Germans of African descent in Germany. The second group are these mixed race offspring of French colonial forces that are stationed in the Rhineland after World War I, because the Rhineland was demilitarized, but it was also occupied by the Western powers. And the French relied then on French colonial forces. Most of them were North African troops, but there were some troops from Senegal, so Black African, that were stationed in these. And you can see how Germans reacted to that. This is part and parcel. This is not Nazi racism. Look, it's 1924. The Nazis were a minuscule party by then. Hitler was sitting in Landsberg prison for attempted revolution. This is part and parcel of Western civilization's prejudice against people of color. Right here, the German press insists that it's a intentional slight that the French have stationed African troops in the Rhineland as a way to debase Germans. And they underscore this. This is Simplicissimus. It's a public magazine. Actually, it's mainly a magazine that talks about satire, but says, look, these African forces in Germany have murdered 78 people. They've caused 65 cases of robbery and abuse, 170 cases of sexual offenses. As a whole, Germans calculated that there were about 500 children born of this mixed race relationship between African French soldiers and German mothers. That the Nazis regarded that as a serious problem that had to be dealt with. And one of the ways they dealt with that was to include them in the forced sterilization program. Now, here's the problem. The law doesn't allow for forced sterilization for racial reasons. So basically, the police had to take these mixed race children individually to uh, German state clinics and request that the child be forcibly sterilized. Now, sometimes they required an authorization, sometimes they didn't. If they requested an authorization, the police didn't have one, they didn't do this operation. Uh, if they just sort of wink, nod, nod, said fine, and then they would carry out the operation, um, you know, that's under the table. It's very hard to document. And we don't really know the reasons why some of these physicians refuse to carry out the sterilization. We don't know whether they had sympathy for the children or whether they, were against Nazi racism, or whether they were just seculars and wanted every I dotted or T crossed, right? This is just an example. This was actually in a race hygiene slide lecture. So this was a slide created to give a lecture on race hygiene. And this was then, we would show as a mixed race offspring of a German woman and a Black African soldier. This is part and parcel of Nazi racial propaganda. They'd say, well, look, this is from a Hitler Youth slideshow. It's a film strip. This is just one of the slides in the film strip. And look, it says the result of this friendship between an Aryan German woman, blonde, fair-skinned, athletic type, and a woman of African descent was the loss of racial pride. That German women, as inherently superior to Blacks, should have a better sense of of her pride than to associate with lesser peoples. This is what they're teaching the Hitler Youth, and it's really, I think, a case where ordinary Germans could recognize racism by sight, and then when they start talking about Jews, where they look like everybody else, they get that same sense. Well, maybe this is the way we're thinking of Africans, is how we should really be thinking about Jews, especially since Nazi propaganda also linked people of African descent with Jews. Here we have a cover of a racist and anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda brochure talking about degenerate music. And if you notice this caricature of a Black musician who's very much has ape-like features, he's wearing a carnation with the Star of David in his lapel, again, linking this sort of degenerate music to the destructive nature of Jews per se, that Jews are trying to undermine the healthy music of German society, and that jazz should be something that should be seen as a way to get you to forget about your responsibilities and just let go into some kind of wild animal-like frenzy. And that's sort of the idea here. Right? The point is that with only 2,500 Germans of African descent, and most of them are North African, frankly, there's no sort of central government policy dealing with Africans, especially since Hitler really wanted to criticize the British Empire. And he couldn't really do that if he was systematically persecuting people of African descent in Germany proper. But I want to point out here, and I think this is a great way to show it tangibly, that because of their skin color, because people of African, either Black skin or brown skin people, North African descent, there was heightened scrutiny by the police about their activities. So because there's always heightened scrutiny of the police towards people of color in Germany, it meant then that there was very little wiggle room for them to get away with any kind of infraction of the rules. The police were much more likely to come down heavy against a person of color. This is, for example, a report sent by IG Farben, the chemical works giant that had a factory in Buna to create synthetic rubber. And here they were requested by the local police to send them a list of all the people of African descent that are working for Buna. And the police want to know their name and their birth date and the place of birth, so that they would have a record of them, and they could then more securely scrutinize their activities. And the company complied and said, look, we don't have anyone who's black-skinned, but we do have a lot of workers who are of African descent, who are brown-skinned. And they sent them a list. So that's sort of indicative of that higher scrutiny, right? So I think it's a good place to stop to ask for more questions. So if you have more questions dealing with this quest for racial purity and the Romani as a victim group, the disabled persons as a victim group, and Germans of African descent as a victim group.
Yes, one question that just came in regarding the Germans of African descent is that beyond the racism and the heightened scrutiny, uh, was there actual actions of persecution beyond? In other words, with discrimination, forced sterilizations, or exclusion, things.
Discrimination and forced sterilization, absolutely. Yes, a number of cases of forced sterilization. I think up to maybe half of the mixed race offspring of French African forces and German women were forcibly sterilized. So we're talking about 400 or so, 500.
Another question I wonder, maybe with your work and affiliation with the museum for so many years, is that I recall, having read, I think it was called Preserving Memory. It was the book about the founding of the USHMM, and I recall there being some significant portions in there where, the Roma Sinti and other such groups were similarly interested in making sure that they were adequately represented in the, within the museum. And I wonder, is there still dialogue around that? And based on your knowledge and your work through the years, do you feel it's adequately represented?
There is talk about that. We're in the middle now of reconceptualizing the permanent exhibition, in part because the museum is almost 30 years old. So the exhibition needs an upgrade. And part of that reconceptualization is a way of maybe integrating the experience of all these victim groups together rather than having just separate panels on each group where appropriate. So it'd be much more, I think, integrated throughout the whole exhibition rather than talked about at various spots individually, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, it's going to be a struggle to do adequately and respectfully. So, I mean, that's the goal. In part, I mean, the fact that we're using the term Roma, Rom, and Romani rather than Gypsy is part of that attempt to really be respectful. We had conversations with the World Romani Union trying to talk about, well, how can we move away from the pejorative gypsy, gypsy, chip, cheat. So that plays into the whole negative stereotype of gypsies as criminal, especially when most Americans know the grouping as gypsies. So one of the things we agreed to was the first time we used the term, we would say gypsies and then put in parentheses Roma, and then from then on use Roma, Rom, and Romani. And I think that has worked regardless of what group it was, because the Roma are the largest ethnic group amongst the Romani, amongst the gypsies, but they're not the only. There's also the Lallerli and the Sinti, and it just depends on the country and the grouping. So I think they agreed that they would accept Rom and Roma and Romani as the designation for all groups that are related in that way.
Wonderful.
So
I'm
that's
glad.
good.
Yeah. So I know we still have a few other groups here to get to, but there's one other
Yes.
question before we proceed with our time. Were those of African descent allowed to get married in Germany? Were there prohibitions on marriage?
They could marry each other, but they were subject to the Nuremberg laws to marry a racial German.
Sure. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Very good. Okay. So now we're going to talk about this, what the Nazis saw as the normal course of history, the racial struggle over resources and arable land, basically, so that you could expand your population base at the expense of your neighbors. And for the Nazis, for Hitler, the only direction for expansion was, of course, to the east, which they saw as a vast, underpopulated area, even though it was heavily populated area. But they regarded it as populated by what they called subhumans. This is part of a Wehrmacht magazine, so German army magazine, that depicts Soviet soldiers as der Untermensch. That means subhuman, the subhuman. So again, lumping all Slavs together as inferiors, as inherently inferior worthy only of being loathed, right? That sort of sets the stage for their policy towards this group. And it's really only understandable in terms of this Nazi racial ideology towards the group. And the policy towards Poles and Soviet prisoners of war are very similar because they're both Slavs. The only difference is that Poles are the Slavs that are closest to the Germans, that the Germans know very well, that Germany had occupied Poland for long stretches of time. So that there was a close relationship between Germans and Poles. And then Soviet prisoners of war because they were Slavs that were in German custody, and they were then completely helpless in the face of Nazi policy. And we'll see that the policy, while similar, has radically different outcomes, right? So the policy is to really show the inferiority of Poles. So all Polish national symbols are systematically and completely destroyed. In fact, as part of the Generalplan Ost, the general plan for the East, the idea was that Slavs should only have up to a 4th grade education, so enough so that they could understand German commands and sign their name to German orders. Right? That was the only kind of education they should have. The dangerous elements should be executed. Typically, these were what the Nazis would say, Poles with some German descent in them, because the German descent made them talented and smart and consequently dangerous. They were the leadership class of the Polish nation. Right away in 1931, they began rounding up what they called the Polish intelligentsia, local teachers, professors, mayors, priests, anything they regarded as carriers of the Polish nation were rounded up and either shot outright. Some 800,000 or 900,000 Poles, non-Jewish Poles, are simply shot or taken to Germany and held in concentration camp. So that the idea then was, without the leadership class, the Poles would resort to their natural state, which in Nazi ideology was a malleable forced labor force, so that every Pole in Poland had to have a job that was useful for the German war effort, and they were deported by the millions to Germany as forced laborers in German industry, where they would wear a badge that said P, or for Pole, for Pole. So to help Germans win the war and to help Germany build the German East at the expense of Poles. So long term, they saw the Slavic peoples as a tame labor force they could use to build Germanized projects in the East. But they also, because of this long heritage of German occupation of Polish and Slavic territories, they systematically examined the children of Poles and also Ukrainians and other Slavs for those that had Aryan features, that were blonde or fair-skinned and the like, and they would kidnap them from their families, send them to Germanization centers. One of them was in the Lodz ghetto, where they would then be Germanized and adopted by German families. This was a way to inject new vigor into the German racial pool, because the Germans wanted to occupy and expand into Polish territory, and the only way they could do that would be to augment the natural population increase through births with absorbing some of what they considered the Germanic elements in the Slavic East.
Will, really quickly, for purposes of clarification, are Poles and Slavs part of the same, essentially larger subset? Are they interchangeable in their view? Okay.
Yeah, non-Jewish Poles are Slavs.
Very good.
Serbs are Slavs, Ukrainians are Slavs, Russians are Slavs, Belarusians are Slavs. The Baltic states, they're Slavs, but with a heavy Germanic element. So, I mean, so this is the way this policy makes sense. You kill the dangerous elements, you use the masses as forced laborers to build German projects in the East, and then you examine their children to see what children can be Germanized and absorbed into your own population. That only makes sense in light of the fundamental points of belief in Nazi racial ideology. So again, we have this statistic of 1.8, 1.9 million Polish civilians, non-Jewish civilians, killed during the war. Some of them are killed because of the war effort, frankly. But if we're talking about racial victims here, we're really talking about the 900,000 Polish civilians, non-Jewish, who were killed as part of this Abaktion, the elimination of the Polish intelligentsia as a way to sort of control Polish resistance movements. And this is the part that makes me kind of chuckle, because this was intended to stop all kinds of anti-Nazi, anti-German resistance to the German occupation. But if you look objectively, Poland had one of the largest national resistance movements anywhere in German occupied Europe. And the way the Nazis explained that was, oh, it's simply because Jews have escaped from the ghettos and they're stirring up trouble in the woods and the rural areas of Poland. So it became an excuse for what they called a Jew hunt, where they'd sweep forests and rural areas looking for escaped Jews, thinking that if they could only catch and eliminate them, then the Poles would be passive. It never happened. It never would happen. Similarly, they did the same thing during Soviets that they captured during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Again, all captured Soviet soldiers were screened to see who were the dangerous elements. Many of them were killed on the spot, especially Soviet officers or those that were Jewish or those that looked Oriental, because there is an Asian part of Russia. They're killed outright on the spot, and by the German army, frankly. They're also sent, by the millions behind the front, where again they're screened by the mobile killing squads, where again the dangerous elements are killed, and then more are transported back to Germany to be forced laborers. But still, tens of thousands of them are killed in concentration camps as target practice, frankly, in the fall of 1941. So again, identify the dangerous elements, kill them, spare as little resources as possible to care for Soviet POWs. This is a POW camp for Soviet soldiers outside of Kharkov. And look, there's no housing, there's no, look, the only perimeter there is basically a rope around the field, and any Soviet soldier that approaches the rope is automatically shot. The only way the Nazis could maintain control of this camp was by use of force constantly. All right, very few resources are spared to house or care for Soviet soldiers. They were considered useless racial stuff, and the army bought into that. That there's no point in taking care of Soviet POWs because they're useless. Right. This looks like it's in Siberia, but it's outside of Hamburg, for God's sakes. It's a Soviet POW camp where the only shelter they have are holes dug into the ground. Right. By January 1942, this is the state of the survivors of this policy of neglect through June 1941 to December 1941. And by then, it's clear that the war is going to be a long war. I mean, the Blitzkrieg has failed in the Soviet Union. So German military leaders go to Hitler and say, look, we got to care for these Soviet POWs because we're going to need them as forced laborers. The war is not over, and it's not likely to be over soon. So can we spend more resources to care for Soviet POWs? And Hitler agrees. He says, okay, spend more resources to care for Soviet POWs so that we can use them as forced laborers. Now, this is exactly at the time, 1942, which is the murder of Polish Jewry. And many of them are skilled laborers that cannot be replaced, and yet they're killed. Because in Nazi ideology, the Germans would be better off killing even skilled laborers if there are no Jews in German territory to disrupt things. So they're ignoring their own economic interests because their ideological imperative says that the mere presence of Jews destabilizes the state and society wherever they're located. Right? That's only understandable in light of Nazi ideology, Nazi racial ideology. This policy where they're going to start devoting resources for the care of Soviet POWs because they need their labor, but they're going to kill Jewish special labor, skilled labor that are irreplaceable because they're Jewish, right? The idea was that, yeah, we have to kill Jews in 1942 and kill the skilled laborers last, but kill them anyway. So this is the overall statistic here. This is the largest non-Jewish victim group that we can talk about in this context. They took so many prisoners, especially in the first year of the war. Of the, was it 6 million or so? 3 million are killed, either shot or they die from this intentional neglect in the beginning part of the war. 1 million escaped the harsh conditions in these camps by joining the Germans. And these become then auxiliary forces, not just for the army, but they also serve the SS. These are the Ukrainians that staff the killing centers, frankly. Treblinka had maybe 30 German SS officers and 80 or 90 Ukrainian auxiliaries to run the camp, right? About 1 million have escaped German custody and have created partisan forces in the countryside in Eastern Europe. And then the rest are the survivors that are liberated at the end of the war. So a very harsh statistic, right? Are there any questions that have been entered in for this Slavs, for Poles or Soviet POWs?
No, other than that clarification point which you answered, we can proceed into the last.
Okay. So I find the last group, even though they're a very small group comparatively to the other two sections, but these are all racially acceptable Germans. These would be members of the body politic of the nation if it weren't for their descent, basically, in one form or another. So, I think political opponents of the Nazi regime are the easiest to understand. These are those that opposed the Nazi rise to power in 1933. They're communist, socialist, trade unionists, avant-garde artists, those that the Nazis called degenerate artists. These are all, considered political opponents of the Nazi regime, especially since many of these sort of avant-garde artists were leftists at the same time, right? So they're summarily arrested as the police gained independent authority over political opponents of the Nazi regime. Now, basically, the political opponents of the Nazi regime are left with two choices. They can either flee Germany, as Willy Brandt did, left Germany in 1933 to Norway, and then as Norway is invaded in 1940, he flees then to Sweden, or they're arrested and then they're held in concentration camp for the entire Nazi period, like Erich Honecker, who becomes an East German leader after the war. I mean, he's held in concentration camp from 35 to 45. So 10 years in concentration camp is a harsh penalty. Now, we know we'll get to that. So we know, right before the war started, the number of concentration camp prisoners was about 25,000. And they're held just in these 7 camps, right? Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Dachau, and Mauthausen. And that most of these 25,000 were political prisoners. Now, during the war, the number of so-called political prisoners expands dramatically, and we have no idea of the numbers, but most of them are non-Germans. So I think it's a whole different kettle of fish. That, really, when we talk about political opponents, we're really talking about these early political opponents of the Nazi regime, right? Jehovah's Witnesses, this is, a very large Jehovah's Witness family, the Kusterovs. They're great friends of the museum. They've donated a lot of their photographs and their papers to us. This is all one family. They had 11 children. The parents are here in the middle, and they are devout Jehovah's Witnesses. They continue to practice their faith through the whole Nazi period, and they all experience, the full extent of Nazi policy towards Jehovah's Witnesses. Those who continue to practice their faith, they're arrested, and most of them are sent to minor prison terms. But then, if they continue to practice their faith, they're sent to concentration camp. Those that are drafted by the German army are in a very harsh position because they won't fight for the German army, and the German army does not recognize conscientious objection. They're put on trial and executed for refusal to join the German army. The state also regards the parents as unfit parents because they're teaching their children not to be part of the body politic of the nation. So the children are taken into custody of the state and removed from the family home. So they are systematically destroyed by the state.
A couple of interesting questions here quickly. One on this specific point regarding the Jehovah's Witnesses. The person asks, unlike the Jews and others persecuted and killed by virtue of their birth, at least as defined by the Nazis, Jehovah's Witnesses had the opportunity to escape persecution potentially and personal harm by renouncing their religious beliefs or converting or whatever. Why didn't they, or did they at all? Why didn't they practice in secret, perhaps?
And here's the form. So, Jehovah's Witnesses that were sent to concentration camp, if they would just fill out this form and sign it, saying that they recognize that the International Jehovah's Witness Association was disseminating, erroneous and dangerous teachings, and that they would not, continue to practice their religion, they would sign it. They could be released. Absolutely, some of them were released. But there were about 30,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany when the Nazis came to power, with German citizenship. So they were Germans who were members of the Jehovah's Witness faith, and about 20,000 of them wind up in prison for continuing to practice their faith. So you're talking about 10,000 that either retreat from public life or agree to disassociate themselves with Jehovah's Witnesses, or agree to sign this form, and you get released, right?
One
So
other
I just
question is, would members, for example, of the confessing church and any other religious opponents to Nazi ideology, to the extent that such were imprisoned and some killed, would they be sort of grouped under the title political dissidents?
no, they actually had their own designation. Funny you should ask, because I have, here it is, hold on. This is the camp designation system for concentration camps, because the SS guards wanted to be able to identify prisoners by sight by the reason for their incarceration. So red triangle, the triangle was the symbol, and then the color indicated the reason why they were in the concentration camp. Red was for political prisoners, green was for criminal types, for professional criminals, habitual criminals. Blue was returning emigres, that's those people that had left Germany or fled Germany when the Nazis came to power, but decided to come back and were considered a danger to state and society and arrested anyway. Purple were the Jehovah's Witnesses, so they had their own designation as a prisoner type in the camp. Pink were homosexuals, and green were the so-called antisocial. Oh, I'm sorry, it shouldn't be green, it should be black. I made a mistake there. Black should be antisocial prisoners. Right, so you can see that, these are the sort of reflecting Nazi racial ideology and the reasons for their incarceration into concentration camp, done so that they, wear these symbols on the outward garments of their prison uniform, so that the guards could see by sight in an instant what kind of prisoner that was. During the war, they added the first letter of the country of origin in German for the prisoner. So a political prisoner from Poland would be wearing a red triangle with a P in black on it. So that would indicate that it was a political prisoner from Poland. This is part of the systemization that we talk about in the Holocaust, right? That the Nazis created systems that, whose goal was ultimate destruction. Great question. So, in the last 5 minutes, we have Jehovah's Witnesses, because basically they alienated themselves from the Volksgemeinschaft by refusing to integrate into Nazi society, refusing to give the Heil Hitler salute, the so-called German greeting, refusing to serve in the military, refusing to take the oath to Hitler. They insisted, that Jehovah was their ultimate allegiance, right? So, about 10,000 of them are tried and convicted for continuing their religious faith. 3,000 of them, at least, wind up in concentration camp. Again, 250,000, more than 250 were killed for refusing military service, and about 800 children were taken from their parents because they were being raised as Jehovah's Witnesses, right? And they are truly, I think, the only prisoners of conscience. Here are a gay couple in Berlin. So even though male sexual activities was illegal in the Imperial and Weimar and Nazi Germany, there was a liberalization in the Republic where gays then became much more open in their relationships. But when the Nazis came to power, the law didn't change. But they immediately, independent police authority began to crack down on gay meeting places, and gay publications were banned by the police. Right, this is El Dorado Club, very famous gay nightclub. You can see that there's a police guard posted in front of it, and Nazi campaign posters are pasted over the windows, right? Paragraph 175, the Nazis revised the criminal code that banned sexual acts between men, making it much easier to prosecute. This is just one example of waves of arrests and persecution of men believed to be homosexual by the police. This is a police identification photograph of one such man. We already talked about this, but so about 100,000 men are arrested by the police on suspicion of engaging in same-sex activity. 50,000 of them are convicted by the courts and sentenced to a prison term in German prisons run by the Ministry of Justice. Typically, repeat offenders are taken into protective detention by the police and sent to a concentration camp. We think maybe thousands of them are killed, in part because gays are at the low end of the hierarchy in concentration camp. They're also particularly targeted by the SS. And frankly, some of their fellow prisoners aren't comfortable with being incarcerated with gay men. So there's some harassment on the other side as well. In any case, the Nazi version of paragraph 175 remained in effect until 1969. So even after liberation, many of these men face persecution in post-war Germany. So let me end in the 3 minutes to spare that this it's perfectly acceptable to think of the Nazi German state as a racist state, right? But anti-Semitism is the core of that racism because they regard Jews, they're racial anti-Semites, basically. So they combine that with this sort of crusade-like mission of saving Western civilization from the destructive nature of Jews, and at the same time have this strategic vision of a dominant German race dominating, much like Britain did in India, the continent of Europe, where Germans are the core of the leadership structure of the society of occupied Europe. And they envisioned that this empire would come from the Rhine to the Urals of some 200 million Germans, Aryan Germans. That's the future. That's the goal. That's the good that Hitler's trying to create, this empire of Germans for Germans from the Rhine to the Urals of some 200 million Germans. And then in order to safeguard the national community, there would be perpetual self-purge of malcontents and dissidents from German society to maintain the unity of that national community under the leadership of the Nazi German state. So thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple last questions if you have them.
Yes, there was a question that did come up regarding the church, in terms of the church, and I mentioned in response to a question the confessing church with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the like and things, but what if you can sort of sum up very briefly, how does one answer the role of the church vis-a-vis the persecution of during the Nazi era?
It's very contradictory because on one hand, Hitler believed in God. I mean, he was raised Catholic. I mean, he wasn't a member of the Catholic faith, but he was raised Catholic. And he wanted his followers to believe in God. But he thought that religions were teaching the strong to tolerate the continued existence of the weak. So they were undermining the natural course of history. So he didn't particularly like organized religions. And the two in Germany was the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. The Lutheran Church split into the sort of the National Lutheran Church that followed the Nazis and the Confessing Church that refused Nazification under the Nazis. But nevertheless, the Lutheran Church as a whole supported the Nazi state and supported the war effort, as did, frankly, the Catholic Church in Germany. So while the Catholics insisted that they have their own worldview, that they have a much more compassionate and humane view of human dignity than the Nazis. So they wanted to maintain that alternative vision of the world. But they supported, every good Catholic had to support the Nazi state and had to support the war effort. That ultimately it's only targeted clergy that either spoke against the state in the pulpit or tried to organize some kind of resistance against Nazi policies that are then arrested by the Nazi German state and sent to a concentration camp. It's not the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church that's targeted. It's individual ministers and nuns and priests who have stepped out of line and then are arrested.
That was as great an explanation to answer that question as I could imagine in such short time. So thank you for that. And beyond, thank you on behalf of everyone that has attended today in our community. We can't thank you enough for joining us, Dr. Meineke. This has been very educational, informative, and hopefully helpful to everyone here, whether you're a teacher or not. And again, very inspirational in terms of confirming the nature of our work and our mission. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. And please feel free to follow up with any questions. And this has been recorded, so if you know of somebody that has missed it, please inquire with us, and we can make sure that you receive a copy of the recording. Thank you again. Will, it's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Bye. Have a
Bye-bye.
good night.